The date is November 7th, 1885 at Eagle Pass in British Columbia. Along the nearly completed Canadian Pacific Railway, two groups from opposite directions are building the final miles of track. Soon the two groups of railway workers had spotted the other group. Soon they would meet. The 5-year project that had started in 1881 was coming to an end. The groups gathered as well with some railway officials like James J. Hill and William Van Horn. And it would be Donald Smith who would set the final spike. Donald got ready to lay the final spike, and he swung the hammer. James Jerome Hill, along with the newly formed Canadian Pacific Railway, created the first transcontinental railway in Canada during the 1870s and 80s. This transcontinental railway was what made British Columbia join the new country of Canada with the creation of the railway, while also breaking the frontier of the rough mountains and terrain of central Canada. The official start of the building of the railway was started in 1881 officially, but we have to go back to 1867, the year that Canada was founded. Provinces all joined together without problem except for British Columbia. British Columbia asked for a transcontinental railway that would travel through the Canadian mountains and forests. In 1871, British Columbia wanted the railway to be built in the next 10 years, and they did that. British Columbia would be a part of Canada. Not much work would be done in the next 2 years. The project was not going well, and there was a lack of money. Now in comes George Stephen and James Jerome Hill. George Stephen was born on June 5th, 1829 in Dufftown, Scotland. James Jerome Hill was born on September 16th, 1838 in Hermosa Township in Upper Canada. By 1874, George Stephen had created a cloth firm called George Stephen and Company. He became one of the biggest financiers in Montreal. He also took an interest in railways, creating the Canadian Rolling Stock Company in 1870. He was also a president of the Bank of Montreal in March of 1876. For James Jerome Hill, he created the Red River Transportation Company in 1872. He had some work on the roads, including the St. Paul and Pacific Railway in 1865. In 1869, Hill met Donald Alexander Smith, who was also a businessman. Smith would also be a huge help for the railway. Hill and Stephen would require the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway. They did that between 1873 and 1874. Fast forward 5 years to May 23rd, 1879, and the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad Company began operation with their new owners. This railroad would have George Stephens as president. Norman Woodford Kinson, who was a fur trader, would be vice president, and James Jerome Hill would take position of general manager. Construction in some form would first start in 1879 when Andrew Onderdoink was hired to create 338 miles of track from Port Moody to Eagle Pass. Onderdoink spent the next 7 years creating his portion of the line, ending in 1885 when he ran out of track. He used over 15,000 workers, a majority being underpaid Chinese workers, exposed to terrible conditions. Sadly, because of this, many workers died without much recognition. In the summer of 1880, George Stephen negotiates to the government to officially start construction. This agreement gave the newly formed Canadian Pacific Railway 25 million Canadian dollars and 25 million acres of land. By that time, they had 713 miles of track already placed down from other railways or previous constructions they had done. They would need over 4,600 though to create the railway. It was estimated to cost over 100 million Canadian dollars, and today that would be over 32 billion United States dollars. On October 21st, a group of Scottish businessmen would fund the railway, with the contract being signed. On February 16th, 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railway would be officially founded. James Jerome Hill would hire a fetus, Betty Stickney, as general superintendent and Thomas Lafayette Rosser as chief engineer. On May 2nd, the construction of the west part of the Transcontinental Railway in Canada would begin. In April Albert Bowman Rogers was hired to find a suitable path through the unexplored Selkirk Mountains. He would find a suitable route in 1883 and would be paid 5,000 Canadian dollars or 100,000 United States dollars today. When he first got the money, he did not cash in the money, keeping it as a souvenir. But it wasn't until William Van Horn would give Rogers a gold watch he would cash in the money. The watch in question is now lost in history, unfortunately, unknown to still exist today. By the end of 1881, only 131 miles of track had been made in that season. So, Stickney and Rosser would be fired, and William Van Horn would take over as a project manager. Sir William Cornelius Van Horn, born on the 3rd of February 1843 near Chesula, Illinois, now known as Frankfort. He had worked on various railways over the years, working in the telegraph office for the Illinois Central Railway, a ticketing agent for the Chicago and Alton Railroad in 1862, and then would acquire the St. Louis, Kansas City, and Northern in 1872. He was part of the contract to start the construction, and he was then made project manager, beginning work on January 2nd, 1882. Donald Alexander Smith was born on August 6, 1820. Smith came in close contact with James Jerome Hill and made a partnership agreement with Hill on March of 1876. By the time the railway had started being built, British Columbia had finally joined Canada, knowing the railway agreement would be met. At the end of 1881, the railroad had only 528 miles of track built, 418 miles being main line and 110 miles being branch lines. When Horn began working on the railway, he started with the section from Flat Creek, also known as Oak Lake, to the tracks being built by Onderdoink. Also in 1882, the Canadian Pacific Railway bought the western section of Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, and Occidental Railway. In 1883, the line from Winnipeg to Calgary was completed. It was clear that the construction of the railway was speeding up quickly. Most of the 1884 season was spent building track in the rough mountains of Canada, mainly unseen land to that point. Building track in the mountains was tough, causing numerous deaths over the building period. Canadian Pacific would also buy Toronto, Gray, and Bruce in 1884. 1885 would also be focused in the mountains. It was the final year of construction. On May 14, 1885, William Van Horn became the vice president of the Canadian Pacific Railway. 2 days later, on May 16th, the Superior Line was completed. Then finally, on November 7, 1885, the east and west trackwork met on Eagle Pass. As said in the beginning, Donald A. Smith was set to swing the hammer to drive the last spike at 9:22 a.m. Pacific time. Unlike the golden spike used for the American Transcontinental Railway, Canadian Pacific used a normal rail. Smith would swing the hammer, and with a few swings, the first transcontinental railway in Canada had been completed. 5 years of work. 4,600 miles of track, the railway was 6 years ahead of schedule. Later that day, some workers staged their own celebration at Donald, British Columbia. On July 4th, 1882, the first transcontinental passenger train was en route. The train took 139 hours. The route would be from Montreal to Port Moody, British Columbia by engine 371. It would not be to Vancouver, as the city had not existed at the time. The first train from Montreal to Vancouver was on May 23rd, 1887, which took 136 hours. There were 150 passengers. Engine 371 would be overshadowed by engine 374, the engine that had pulled the first train from Montreal to Vancouver. 371 would be scrapped in October of 1915. Canadian Pacific engine 374 still survives today and is on display in Vancouver, British Columbia.